Welcome to Scotland Speaks at our usual time of 10 a.m. on a rather windy morning in Edinburgh. A far cry from the sun at Bannockburn that shone on everyone marching for independence. Now in last week's show I had the privilege of interviewing Debbie Ewan, the Alba Party's women's convener. Let's hear what she had to say about next year's election. Now you spoke about single-sex spaces. They're often seen in a context where women are in difficult situations, these personal or domestic situations, but it also applies, as you'd mentioned earlier, to workplace scenarios where it's important for women to be their best, sometimes to receive training in a single-sex environment. Tell me a bit about how you think that works in a workplace environment and how that can then be translated from a political perspective.
So if I give you an example of something like public speaking, for instance, one of the barriers that I found in human resources in getting women into roles where there was a public-facing element and there was a role for public speaking within it was that they were scared of making a fool of themselves in front of lots of men who maybe were more confident, whether they should be or not, they were more confident.
And worried less about making a fool of themselves.
Worried less about making a fool of themselves and more willing to laugh at themselves. Unfortunately, sometimes women are more concerned about that and don't actually want people laughing and joking. They take it too personally. And so running training sessions where women could, practice on one another and, and build their skills and get feedback from their peers is actually much more, reasonable way for women to develop those skills so they're then confident going in and applying for jobs. The same type of thing applies completely in politics. It always frustrates me when there's probably 3 or 4 times the number of men get up and stand and speak at conference than there is women. There'll be one woman and then that will be followed by about 6 or 7 men. And then there'll be another couple of women and then another 6 or 7 men. And so that's a problem because women will not just get up and speak off the cuff. They want to have a certainty that they're going to do a good job. Mm-hmm. And so giving them the chance to practice that by running workshops, etc., and allowing them to practice in a scenario where they feel safe, no one's going to laugh at them, they're not going to make a fool of themselves, will encourage, I feel, more women to come forward. It may be at conference, it may be talking to people on doors, it may be, speaking up in a committee or something like that. But it will give them more confidence of being able to speak when they're asked to.
And here's what some of you had to say in response. James said, "Brilliant as always, Tasmina, a very enlightening show. Would be great to see more women in politics, indeed, James." Harold says, "Yep, keep going round the doors, it's so important. It lets folk know you're active. It gives the party valuable data, the ordinary concerns of ordinary folk. It allows you to show how you will deal with the problems created by all sorts of people, organisations and politicians." And Geronimo says, "What a great chat and so interesting. Debbie's had a fantastic career. She clearly has so much experience. What a lovely lady she is indeed. Good luck to all pro-Indy candidates. Independence and nothing less for Scotland. Keep the faith." And in terms of keeping the faith, I'm delighted to be joined today by Jim Sillars. He has a great story to tell, some great advice to give all of us about what's happening in the Middle East and of course what needs to happen in Scotland. So stay tuned and we'll hear from Jim after the break. Jim Sillars, thank you so much for joining me on Scotland Speaks. As we were just talking about off camera, the last time I was here was with Alex, where he was sitting in this very seat interviewing you, and we will take time to reflect, as we always do in every show, on Alex and his legacy and your personal thoughts slightly later on. Can I start actually by talking about what's the most important thing in the moment, and that is what's happening in Gaza and continues to happen in Gaza, and now Iran. And of course you were, Jim, amongst many other things, assistant to the General Secretary of the Arab British Chamber of Commerce, and you have a great insight into all things Middle East. May I take your views first of all on what's happening in Gaza? What is the way forward? Is there one at all? What needs to change for there to be one? And how difficult has now what's happened in Iran, happening in Iran, making that situation?
There's the short term and the long term. In the short term, the tragedy is that there's very little the world, and I'm talking about states in the world and peoples in the world, can actually do to reverse Israel's policy in Gaza at the present time. As long as Israel has America's money, weapons, political backing, and the veto in the Security Council at the United Nations, the rest of the world's paralysed. Now we can beat our breasts, we can go on the streets and we can demonstrate, we can launch verbal and written attacks on Israel's conduct, but the brutal fact is we're paralysed. That's the short term. The long term, I think, is different. And if I was an Israeli, I would be very worried about the long term. Israel has managed to lose the rest of the world. All those years when Israel gave two up to the United Nations resolutions came home to roost. Very little attention was paid to it. October the 7th happened. On October the 8th, the Security Council had an informal meeting to discuss what it would do in response to October the 7th. It couldn't come to any agreement. Now you say, how is that? I mean, this was a fairly important event. It was, in fact, a number of people said, given what Israel's conduct has been in relation to resolutions from the United Nations, given what its conduct has been for years since 1967 in the West Bank and then in Gaza again, we're not coming to its aid on this occasion. Now that would be a warning bell for any Israeli statesman. But as someone who's a supporter of Israel said about a fortnight ago, if Mr. Netanyahu is a statesman, he does a very good job of camouflaging it. So in the long term, what's happening in the United States, which is the banker for Israel. Among the student body of the United States, that's at the highest level of universities and the lower level of colleges, students are seeing Israel in a way that Americans have never seen it before. And there is an anti-Israel attitude taking root in the United States. Now that doesn't matter immediately, but these young people are going to be tomorrow's lawyers, tomorrow's leaders, tomorrow's newspaper people, media reporters, politicians, and people in power. And that generation, I doubt very much, will toe the line automatically on Israel's favour in the future. So if I was an Israeli for the long term, I would be very worried about what I'm doing today and the consequences of tomorrow. In the meantime, I don't think the world can do anything except complain, because as long as America's there, Netanyahu as long as he can remain in power in Israel, and he has America's backing, will be able to do whatever he likes in Gaza. That's a very, very difficult thing for us all to swallow. But that's the realpolitik.
On the point of young people, which is a really important point, what about the young people in Israel and the young people in Gaza, in Palestine, and what the future means for them? Because surely within them, because of the death and destruction that they've seen on both sides, and we're not saying that everyone in Israel supports Netanyahu, clearly they do not. Yep. What we're going to have is a generation of young people growing up very angry at people they've lost, family members, people close to them, entire communities being destroyed. How does that bode for future peace in the region?
Well, I think the idea was always a stupid idea that Netanyahu had of totally eliminating Hamas. That's gone. Hamas will be already recruiting Hamas too. I mean, if I'm 17-year-old and I watch my mother, my father, my wee sister and, my niece being destroyed by the Israelis, I'm going to want revenge and I'm going to go to Hamas. That's obvious. And by the way, I am not a Hamas supporter in any way. I despise Hamas. And I'd point out, for example, that Hamas have been able to build miles of underground tunnels, and it never seemed to cross their mind to build one shelter for the people. Now, Hamas are well aware that if they provoke Israel, as they did on the 7th of October, then the retaliation is going to be immense. But they don't seem to worry terribly much, and probably put it down, as Sinwar actually said in an interview with the Times, this is martyr's blood. So I'm not a Hamas supporter. I just look objectively on it. If I were a young Gazan, I would join Hamas. Israel's a different kettle of fish. Recent polls taken within Israel are quite disturbing. You actually now have a high percentage of Israelis who would deport the Israeli Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. And although there are young Israelis, some in the military, have refused to go into Gaza and are prepared to go to jail along with it, by and large, all the Israeli population, young and old, hold to the view that what happened after 7th of October means that a two-state solution is not acceptable to them. So I don't see anything except perpetual violence in Palestine and Israel. And I'm sorry to say that, but if you look at it, Hamas won't change. Israel won't change. Both of them have used violence time and time and time again. And, as Einstein said, one of the signs of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different conclusion. The language in Palestine, now I take it the whole of Palestine from the 1920s on to the formation of Israel and the West Bank, the language on both sides has been violence. I don't see any statesman on either side being able to come and tell both peoples a very hard truth and setting a new road. That hard truth on the Israeli side would be to tell the Israelis that in 1948 we did great harm to the Palestinians. Israel was built upon their ejection. And you would have to have a Palestinian able to tell the Palestinians that A, Israel is a fact on the ground, is not going to be eliminated, and there's going to be no return to the land that was held previously in what is now the state of Israel. Now, those are two truths. Neither side have the statespeople able to tell either side the truth. And until the truth is told, and until the truth is accepted, I'm afraid we're in for perpetual violence.
Obviously, that's a very pessimistic, oblique, realistic view, Jim. What point then, the question asks and is continually asked and is being asked certainly around Iran also, the United Nations, why is it so powerless in the face of all of this violence, as you speak of? There's long been talk of the need for reform of the United Nations. It needs to do what it's saying on what it says on the tin. There needs to be reform of the permanent members who holds the veto. But until that happens, it seems that the United Nations can pass with the best will in the world a number of resolutions, but they can't take effect.
Well, it depends under which chapter that the Security Council pass a resolution. A lot of my Arab friends always argued about the double standards, that resolutions are passed, even with America joining in or abstaining, resolutions are passed against Israel, it ignores them, nothing happens. Resolutions are passed against an Arab state like Iraq, bang, sanctions, bang, invasion. The difference is Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. A resolution under Chapter 6 is mandatory, but there is no thing that the UN Security Council can do if the state says, yeah, couldn't care less. And so resolutions against Israel have always been Chapter 6. If you come to Chapter 7, now we're in a different ballgame. Chapter 7 resolutions carry a penalty if you don't behave. That means sanctions, international sanctions. Every state having to comply is applied to the offending state. But there's no chance of a Chapter 7 resolution against Israel because America would veto. And even if we changed the numbers and a number of states on the Security Council in terms of permanent membership, you won't take the United States off the Security Council. Therefore, Israel, in a sense, it's Israel, through the Americans, will continue to have the veto. And, you know, the United States doesn't have any military ability to impose itself on any member state. It can sanction, but only under Chapter 7. And Israel is 100% protected against a Chapter 7 resolution.
And do you feel that Trump's conduct, first of all, he was elected on a manifesto of peace, and then again for a nomination by Pakistan for the Nobel Peace Prize, yet here we find where we are. Do you think that Trump is veering the idea that deal-making and unilateralism carries much more weight and value than multilateralism, and using all of these various arms, be it the United Nations or the European Union, to help forge peace?
The United States has had a mix in terms of quality of presidents since it first became independent. But it's never had a president who qualifies as an ignoramus, as Trump does. Trump's knowledge of the world outside of hustling real estate in New York is, I believe, non-existent. I doubt if he's ever read a book on world politics, and he certainly has never read anything or has any understanding of the history of the Middle East and how Western involvement in the Middle East since the time of the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire has been a malignant factor in that region. I think the man, if you're looking for someone who is totally ignorant, then you'll find him in the White House. And that's one of the problems that the world has in dealing with this man.
That takes us on to Iran and what's currently happening and Trump's involvement in backing Israel, what is your view on how long we think these tensions are going to continue? Very dangerous tensions. We've all watched United Nations General Assembly and Security Council, I should say rather, meet and discuss what needs to happen, asking for a cessation of all violence, of all attacks, and diplomacy to entail. How realistic or possible is that given the players and given we have the ongoing conflict in Gaza running concurrently?
I don't think Israel gives a damn about what the United Nations, or indeed any other country in the world except America, says. Israel ignores all international law. It goes on its own self-defined national interests as described by Netanyahu personally. So Israel won't change. It's attacked Iran on the basis of degrading its nuclear capability, but has gone a bit further and is talking about regime change. This is
although they've rolled back on that this week, as ever, the White House, it rolls back on the president's pronouncements and have said, well, that was just sort of floated. But
yeah, that was Trump. But Netanyahu hasn't rolled back. This is fairyland stuff. I don't see Israel stopping its attacks on Iran. I don't see Iran retaliating against Israel. It's what Iran does in respect of the United States that is the most interesting for those involved in international politics. Now, it could, perfectly capable of striking at US assets in the Middle East, in the Gulf in particular. But it knows that if it does that, then the man in the White House will give them even more devastating blitzes from the skies. And at the moment, the fact is that Iran has really no ability to stop the United States doing that. So it could sew up the Strait of Hormuz, but then it's damaging one of its main allies, China, who gets 80% of its oil from Iran. It's not likely to do that. It would also damage the trade of its Arab neighbours, whom it's had a rapprochement with and whom it wants to maintain good relations with. So that's out. The big things appear from the Iranian point of view to be out. But it can do what a state can do that other states cannot prevent it from doing, and that is withdrawing from the non-proliferation agreement. And I understand from today's news that that process has started in the parliament. Now, from Iran's point of view, that's quite sensible. Because if you withdraw from that particular treaty, then the inspectors from the IAEA no longer have any right to go in and monitor your nuclear program. And by the way, under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, Iran is perfectly entitled to develop uranium enrichment. But you come out of that treaty and you're as secret as Israel. Nobody knows what you're doing. And you're at 60% of enrichment of uranium just now. And apparently it's relatively easy to go from 60 to 30. And if you listen to the academics who know a great deal, the experts, the academic experts on Iran, there's a faction inside the regime which has been arguing for some time that given the theory of deterrence, Iran should go and have its own nuclear weapon. And right now, I would expect them to be saying to whoever's in charge, look, we told you, if we had had our nuclear weapon, they would never have attacked us.
And indeed, if Trump hadn't withdrawn from the Joint Comprehensive.
That's right.
plan of action.
So they don't trust America in any treaty organisation. The Non-Proliferation Treaty has been to its disadvantage. Maintaining the standards within it has been to Iran's disadvantage. You come out of it, you can then develop a nuclear weapon. Now, that's the first towards getting a nuclear weapon. There is still another obstacle for Iran, and that's the fatwa. There is a fatwa issued by the present Supreme Leader against Iran acquiring and using a nuclear weapon on the basis that it is non-Islamic in terms of ethics. And I would imagine there's pressure for that fatwa to be cancelled. But at the moment, it has not been cancelled. But I would imagine Iran will now proceed to the ability. I think that's why, if I can just go back a bit, why they went from the normal level of enrichment of uranium for civil purposes up to 60%, which is far exceeds your civil need. It gave them the potential to go relatively quickly to full enrichment and therefore a weapon. So they've went for the potential where they're still held back by the fatwa. But if the fatwa is cancelled, Iran will have a nuclear weapon. This is one of the ironies. Trump demonstrated to Iran why Iran should have a nuclear weapon. Because we've always argued the UK's got the bomb, France got the bomb. Everybody who has the weapon argues the theory of deterrence. Because we've got it, nobody will attack us. And the message to Iran is, if you had had the bomb, we wouldn't have attacked you. Get the bomb and you'll be safe. This is stupidity beyond stupidity by an ignoramus.
Jim, how would you mark the report card of the United Kingdom government on both Gaza and Iran?
Well, on Gaza, they're like you and me personally. There is actually not a great deal they could do, except the one thing that they won't do, and that's make sure that any contribution the UK makes to weaponry which arrives in Israel's hands is no longer available. Outside of that, they're in no position any more than China or anybody else is to stop what's happening in Gaza, because we have no influence on the United States. I'll take you back to Iraq, just as an example. Abdul Karim, the Secretary General, Lord Pryor, the Chairman, and myself had a private meeting with Jeremy Greenstock. Jeremy Greenstock was the UK ambassador at the UN during the Iraq situation. And we met him just before he went to Iraq as the American's number 2. And it was a very private meeting, so we would never dream of saying anything at the time, but it's okay now. We asked him how much influence did the UK have on America in respect of the Iraq war. He said 10%. And we said, you're going out there, how much influence will you have on the guy who's the US Viceroy in control of Iraq? And he said, 10% of 10%. I don't believe that has changed in respect of Gaza or in respect of Iran. In fact, one of the most symbolic pictures that almost tells the whole story is in Canada, when Trump's holding the trade treaty papers, and they drop. And the picture is the British Prime Minister kneeling at the feet of the United States President, picking them up. Never crossed Trump's mind. He dropped them, never crossed his mind to pick them up. That's really a symbolic picture that tells a story in more than 1,000 words possibly could. We don't have influence on America. Where the UK government is concerned is the Muslim vote in Britain. Make no mistake about it. That's their main concern. They have to make sounds so that Muslim people in Britain listening think, nah, it's not a bad thing to say, we quite agree with that.
So there'll be a concern on that basis, Jim, by the UK government that where is Israel going to stop? There's been mentioned this week by a former minister that Pakistan is next. Lots of Pakistanis in the United Kingdom.
This is unbelievable, actually. I mean, why Pakistan? You know, Pakistan's a real problem country, well, but who's that a problem to? India.
And so,
I mean, where does it? Where does
one could then look at the very interesting and important visit that JD Vance had to India not that long ago. Where does this all end, Jim? We should be concerned. Obviously, Gaza, Palestine, Iran, people speaking about Pakistan.
Well, the world that was set up in Bretton Woods in 1944 was a world that the United States crafted out of Bretton Woods, where you got the IMF, the World Bank, GATT, which led to the WTO, the concept of international law, stability. That world has gone in a trice. Trump has destroyed it without question. Putin helped, but Trump has destroyed it. We are now back to the world before the First World and the Second World War, where it's major powers and the balance of power between them that matter, where might is actually right in the international field. This is where we are now. And in that world, you require people who are in very powerful positions to elevate themselves to the level of being able to think like statesmen. Now, what distinguishes statesmen from your normal politician is the ability to take today and realise the consequences that might come tomorrow if this happened or that happened, or I did this or I didn't do that. The world is short of them right now. I can't think of anybody anywhere that meets that level. And given that America, not the man in the White House, not only doesn't meet that level, but falls so far below it, that's a danger that actually nobody can contain. We're not sure what this man can do tomorrow morning.
What about, Jim, because it's
and this is a very pessimistic, but,
it is pessimistic.
But we are in a very, I've been in politics since I left the Navy in 1960. Yeah, that's a long time. And I've gone through all sorts of things, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the coldest of the Cold War, the détente periods, the dissolution of the Soviet. I've been through all of that. I've never been in a world as it is now, where there are no guiding principles for state-to-state relations. The Charter of the United Nations has become meaningless. And that's a tragedy for humankind. And how we get out of it, really, it is well beyond me.
Jim, we're going to continue this discussion after the break, where we're going to move from what you've detailed as something over which we can have no control over to our own country, Scotland, and what next for our future. See you then. Welcome back to Scotland Speaks, where I'm delighted to be joined by Jim Sillars. Jim, Alex Salmond, the titan of the independence movement, lost tragically and so early and so painfully in Ohrid just a few months ago.
This is one of, in history, Scotland has had tragedies. This is one of them, one of the big tragedies. Because Alec, I spoke at several meetings with Alec fairly recently, and the man was on top of his form. He was actually better, I believe, than when he led the SNP. in terms of leadership ability. And right now, had there been Alec here, with the polls showing 54%. I don't believe that's necessarily rock solid 54, but it's a clear indication of a sense of direction. He would have been able to grasp that and take us on and upward, because he would have been able to provide the kind of leadership that we do not have and have not had since he demitted office in 2014. You know, that's just a hard fact. I'm a member of the SNP, but you know, the SNP leadership is third rate compared to Alex Salmond. He was head and shoulders above everybody else. And you know, a Salmond today would have taken us charging forward instead of where we are. We're apparently, and I use the term advisedly, you know, apparently stuck somehow, even with 54% in the polls. How Scotland's cursed on occasion with these tragedies is just one of the facts of our history, and Alec is one of them.
He spoke, Jim, as you say, at many meetings with yourself about how the scales had tipped in terms of, it used to be the case that the SNP had the support and independence was less in number, and the scales have tipped and have been tipped for quite a period of time, where support for the SNP is decreasing, and support for independence is at least steady at over 50% without even a campaign for it.
This is the miracle, actually, because
part of his legacy, perhaps, Jim?
Well, I hope it is, because it's a strange thing to say. I think Alec's death, if you remember the memorial service for Alec in St Giles Cathedral, it was a wonderful service and a proper tribute to the man. But what mattered for me was the people outside, nobody had organised them, huge crowds outside. And I went over to talk to them, and they, it was almost as if, okay, Alex died, we owe him this. We owe him, to take it forward. And there was almost a new determination in what people were saying to me as I met them on that particular day. Now, the pessimists will look and say, well, you're at 54% in the polls, but there's no mechanism that captures that 54%. That's absolutely true, because the movement at the moment is split and splintered. You've got the SNP, you've got ALBA, that's the split and splinter. There's apparently 21 organisations, all doing their own thing inside the movement. Some are going down rabbit holes, but others are doing very substantial work below the radar. What is missing is a national organisation that brings the material that they're producing and disseminates it politically at grassroots level, at street level, to not just build the vote, but solidify the vote. Because if we get up solid, 55% and above, then you can turn that into electoral success. Actually, I'll take you through. There are 4 steps to independence. One is building and solidifying the vote. When you've done that well over 55%, you then take that and make the advantage electorally. You sweep the board. And my mind is on 2028 or 29 Westminster elections, first past the post. If you're at 55%, you've swept the board. There may be only 2 seats you don't take. You therefore have the political and moral authority to demand and get the referendum. That's stage 3, is to win the referendum. But when we win at 10 p.m. on Thursday, we're not independent on Friday morning. That's where you come to stage 4, where there's a transition to a vesting day for independence, during which you negotiate with England a treaty that regulates your relationships in this one single island. If the movement gets that 4 stages well into its head and concentrates on the first stage at the moment, then you move to stage 2 and stage 3 very easily. In the meantime, and I've been talking to people in the movement about the need for the negotiating brief to be compiled now and constantly updated, so we don't wait until the Friday morning when we say, oh my God, we're going into negotiations. What's our red lines? What's their red lines? What's important to us? What's important to them? We do that work now. The paper's ready for us and we know how to negotiate and we go into the negotiations. What we require to make the first move really successful, building and consolidating, is a national campaign. And there's lots of people at the moment talking about building this national campaign. There's lots of yes groups still around the country from 2014. To their credit, they've remained in place. They're the building blocks for a national campaign. And if we get a national campaign off the deck, then I see as being in a position to demand the referendum and win it in 28 or 2029.
Let's unpack that a bit further, Jim. First of all, your point about speaking to people outside the memorial. Of course, Alex always said that the people would never go back into the shadows. That had all changed in 2014 after the referendum, and he was absolutely correct. And yes, many of them were there, unprompted, but there, and speaking loudly and with a renewed determination and looking for the leadership to take us across the line. And there is a lot of good work going on across the board, but a lot of different ideas as to the way to get there. Obviously, I chair the ALBA party. I want to speak to you about the Scottish Parliament election because you've spoken specifically about the Westminster election and how important the 2026 election is and how that should be framed. Our view in ALBA is that should be seen as a plebiscite, should be seen as the vote, the list vote, the vote for independence, if you want independence. And of course, we need the parties to rally behind that. The public need to understand what the meaning of that vote is. And there's been calls on John Swinney, Kenny's written to him, Kenny McCaskill, to say, look, let's have a discussion, because surely if we tell the electorate that the list vote is about independence, those supporting independence can vote that way. That gives them that option. And secondly, to make sure we don't have hundreds and thousands of wasted votes on parties that don't benefit from the list system.
You may have noticed that I've mentioned a national campaign and not mentioned the SNP leading it. I think the SNP has a major problem, and that brings me to say that I don't think what ALBA would like to happen in 2026 will in fact happen. The SNP leadership now has one objective in mind, and that is to survive in ministerial office, even if a minority government in 2026.
You think that's
I don't believe that they will have any conversation with ALBA or anyone else, and that they will tell their members and everybody else to vote in the constituency for the SNP and on the list for the SNP. I believe the SNP leadership is now parochialised itself on purely the leadership's interest. And when you say the SNP, as I explained to someone earlier last week, the SNP is no longer the membership as it used to be when I was active. The SNP can now be defined as John Swinney and the cabal around him. The membership has no influence on the leadership. It has been reduced to a happy-clappy encore. And Swinney's concern is to remain as First Minister, even if in a minority government. And they won't have any truck with anyone else. And so the SNP is a problem for the movement. I think we'll come to the point after 2026 of realising that, and realising there has to be a different national movement who goes for electoral success. Now, I could be wrong, but that's my analysis of the situation, looking at the SNP and also understanding John Swinney, whom I've known since 1980. This is one of the most conservative, most cautious, mediocre people I know in Scottish politics. He's not big enough to do what you think should be done.
The national organisation, Jim, of which you speak, which you're working on, your suggestion is that they stand candidates in the...
No, I don't know. I don't know how we will actually do it. What I do know is that the first thing we must do is build and consolidate that vote. That in itself, in doing that, you're campaigning and you're discovering talent and ability that's probably been lying there, not used, not come forward. New talent, new ability with new ideas. And in that setting, a new dynamic can take place that will produce its own new leadership. And they will decide how they're going to go. My generation's job is to try and set up the circumstance in which they can come forward. There's no chance of them coming forward inside the SNP. The SNP leadership is only interested in the promotion of mediocrity and killing. Mediocrity always kills talent. The talent now lies outside the boundary of the SNP, but it's unorganised. It has no sense of direction. The idea of a national campaign is to embrace it, involve it, and give it that sense of direction and see what emerges.
Why then, Jim, can the 2026 election to our Parliament, Scots Parliament, be used as a mechanism to bring the talent forward to stand? I mean, for example, just very recently, Fergus is now standing as an independent, Fergus Ewing, and we can speak about that because you have great insight on that, because Margot famously, the late great Margot, won as an independent. These are people deciding they don't want to do it the SNP way anymore. Yeah. The cause is much greater than that, and for many ways the cause has been let down by the SNP. Do you not think that Fergus, along with my party, the Alba Party, along with many other independent candidates who may stand, may be able to drive independents across the line in 2026 if we work together now? A call that's been made by our party leader, Kenny.
Well, let me take the independents as distinct from Alba. It's easy to get yourself nominated. Just a few names on a nomination paper. And you're talking about the list. And you come out and suddenly you're confronted not with one constituency, but 9. I mean, when Margot stood, we were confronted with 9 constituencies and 360,000 electors and only half a dozen or a dozen people and £15,000. That's all we had. Guy came down from the northeast, funded by the fishermen, so they weren't short of money. And I took the poor man through it, but knew not a hope in hell. The logistics are enormous. I mean, you've got no party, you don't know where your vote lies, you've no workers of the number required. Margot and Dennis Canavan could overcome that with their public persona. Margot, an independent, could call a press conference and get the press to come. Somebody else trying that, nothing doing. So the independents, I think they're just wasting their time. What I would reckon the role of Alba is to punt the new case for independence and get 2 things through to the Scottish people. One is the concept of Scottish state interests, not a concept we've had to bother with for over 318 years. State interests have always been dealt with down in London, and that's been by and large UK/English. I don't believe we're a colony, and I think this is one of the rabbit holes people have gone down, and people outside won't take that on. What happened in 1707 was that the ones in charge of Scottish state interests regarded the best Scottish state interest was to join with England in a new country, gain access to the English market uninterrupted and access to a growing empire. That was in the Scottish state interest. 318 years later, it is in the Scottish state interest to look at our companion in the British state and say we no longer want to be politically aligned with you. And the reason is quite simple. If you take England as the main component of the United Kingdom economy, it is now in irretrievable decline. The argument of 2014 that little Scotland had to shelter under the umbrella of the great, big, powerful United Kingdom economy is no longer valid. Nothing works. And I quote a headline in the Tory Daily Telegraph: "The United Kingdom is a poor country pretending to be rich." It lives on an international credit card. It has a debt heading towards £3 million. It spends over 100 billion in debt interest every year, more than it does on education and on defence. It is a country that is broken. It is no longer in Scottish state interest to be further linked and associated politically. That's the argument you should put to the people during the 2026 election to get that into their heads. And if you had no other achievement in that election, getting that into their heads is very important post 2026 in building that vote. That's the reason we don't want to be linked any longer. They're an anchor round our necks. Now, I'm very sorry about that, but 5 million people cannot solve the problem of 60 million south of the border. All we can do is escape and save ourselves. Now, that's hard. That's a hard thing to say, but that is what you say when you're discussing state interests.
And that is indeed, when we, perhaps unlike some other parties, we do knock doors, Jim. And speaking to people is very important, and having these discussions is very important. It's certainly something that Alba is doing, and very much along the lines in which you state, in the hope that 2026 we don't end up with a unionist parliament, which is a reality surely we must be considering.
Oh, I don't think John Swinney has thought about this, but I have. Suppose the SNP, which is likely, still becomes the party with the most seats. Not anywhere near a majority. Most party with the seats. John thinks he'll be First Minister in a minority government, able to wangle around. What if the Unionists decide, no, we're not having an SNP government? Even if Labour doesn't have a huge number of seats, Labour and the Liberals get together and the Tories will say, look, we will not oppose you becoming the government. From their point of view, from the Unionist point of view, you have a Unionist government in, and from the Tory Unionist point of view, it may be a lib-lab government, but the minority, they're still subject to our influence. And by the way, the whole lot of us have sidelined the SNP. They can be the official opposition. Who cares? Mm-hmm. I don't think he's thought of that.
Which is why I don't know if he
has.
But
I can tell you some of the union. I mean, I'm not sectarian. I talk to everybody. I have lunch with people and coffees with people. That's how the unions are thinking.
Hence, again, as we close this discussion, and I wish you well with all the work that you're doing, Jim, in bringing the movement together. As you say, we need the wise heads to get people on the ground to do what is necessary. And I wish you well. And as you well know, Alba will contribute in any way, in any means necessary to advance the cause of Scottish independence, and hope to be fully involved in whatever you're doing. But bearing in mind just your last comment there about unionists already thinking about this, even if it would be surprising, perhaps not, John Swinney isn't thinking about it. doesn't that then speak to the point that the Alba Party is trying to make about the importance of ensuring a nationalist majority in 2026 and how we must work together to ensure that that's the outcome?
Yes, but working together is not in the playbook of the SNP. I mean, have you not got the message yet? That is not in their playbook. It wasn't there with Nicola and it's not there with John. It's their ball and they're going to play with it.
All I suppose that I can say to you in this interview is hope that those who vote for that party listen to what you are saying and understand what needs to be done in 2026 to get independence across.
We can come to the day when we say, well, to the SNP, you're only part of the movement. Very nice to have you. The rest of the movement's crashing on. I'm very optimistic. As a matter of fact, I have a book coming out in August called There is Still a Case for Optimism.
Well, Jim Sillars, can I say I very much look forward to interviewing you on the subject of your book, which I very much look forward to reading as well. It's due, timely and absolutely necessary for Scotland. Jim Sillars, thank you so much for joining me on Scotland Speaks.
You're welcome.
And with that, from very windy Edinburgh, we come to the end of this week's show. I do hope you've enjoyed listening to Jim Sillars as much as I've enjoyed interviewing and hearing from him. It's cold, it's windy, but we remain undaunted in our quest, our desire, our mission to deliver Scottish independence. And with that in mind, let us play you out with the most important video about how we need to vote in next year's 2026 Scottish parliamentary elections to ensure that Scottish independence is on the cards in the here and now, not in the hereafter. With that, bye-bye for now, and we'll see you next week.
Here's how the Scottish elections work in 2 minutes. Scotland is split up into 8 regions. Each region has around 9 local constituency MSPs that you vote for using your lilac-coloured ballot paper. This vote is simple. The candidate with the highest vote in each constituency wins the seat. Each region then has to elect another 7 MSPs on what's called the regional list. These 7 are elected using your peach-coloured ballot paper. Here you vote for one party. Each party's votes are counted up and then they are divided by the number of seats that party has already won, plus 1. For example, in 2021, the SNP won 9 constituency seats in the North East. The 148,000 votes they got on the regional list were divided by 10, giving them just under 15,000 votes. The other 133,000 votes were wasted. This meant the SNP did not win a single seat on the regional list in the North East of Scotland. Despite getting the most votes in every region, the SNP only won 2 of 56 regional list seats up for grabs, with unionist parties picking up 46 of them. If, however, SNP voters had decided to back Alba on the regional list instead, the 46 seats won by unionist parties would have been cut to 24. The SNP would have sacrificed just 2 single seats, and in return, the second largest party would have been the pro-independence Alba Party with 30 seats. It would have been an independence supermajority in the Scottish Parliament. In 2026, don't waste your vote. Vote Alba on the regional list.